You are sitting around a fire. The smoke drifts into your face. You breathe it in without thinking. You have been doing this for 1,000,000 years. That is not a figure of speech. For roughly 1,000,000 years, your ancestors sat beside open flames every single night, breathing whatever the fire happened to be burning: wood smoke, bone smoke, grass smoke, and occasionally plant smoke that did something more. Today, smoking kills 8 million people a year. Cigarettes are engineered industrial, addictive by design. But before any of that, before tobacco companies and warning labels and nicotine patches, there was just a fire and a plant and a curious brain trying to make sense of what it felt. So, when exactly did humans start smoking? The answer is far older and far stranger than you probably think. To understand it, you have to start not with tobacco, but with fire itself. The earliest evidence of your ancestors using fire comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. Researchers led by anthropologist Michael Chazan of the University of Toronto and paleontologist Francesco Berna of Boston University analyzed microscopic traces of ash and charred bone fragments found deep inside the cave in layers dated to roughly 1,000,000 years ago. This was Homo erectus, an ancestor who predates modern humans by hundreds of thousands of years. They were not building cigarettes, they were barely building fires. But they were burning things, and they were sitting in the smoke. Here is what most people miss about that discovery. The fire was 30 meters inside the cave. No wildfire reaches 30 meters into solid rock. These early humans had carried flame from somewhere outside and brought it in. Why? Perhaps for warmth, perhaps to frighten predators, perhaps for reasons we will never fully know. But the result was undeniable. Every night around that fire they inhaled smoke. Whatever plant matter went onto those flames, they breathed it. For thousands of generations. Now think about what smoke actually is. Smoke is not just carbon dioxide and heat. Smoke carries the volatile chemical compounds of whatever is burning. Resins, alkaloids, terpenes. These are the biologically active molecules inside plants. Some of them do nothing. Some of them are mildly pleasant. And some of them, depending on the plant, alter your brain chemistry in measurable ways. Your ancestors did not need to understand organic chemistry to notice the difference. Imagine sitting beside a fire that someone has just fed with a particular plant. The smoke thickens. It smells different. And about 15 minutes later, you feel different. Calmer. Slightly dizzy. Your hunger becomes distant. The pain in your feet fades. You look at the person across the fire, and something about the light around their head looks soft and golden. Would you remember which plant went on the fire that night? Ethnobotanist Christian Ratch, who spent decades studying the ritual use of plants across cultures, documented hundreds of examples of communities around the world burning specific plants for exactly this effect, not to consume them, but to breathe them. The smoke was the delivery system. The altered state was the result. And in many cases, the communities doing this had inherited the practice over so many generations that no one could remember who had started it or why. The first documented archaeological evidence of deliberate smoke inhalation for its psychoactive effects, meaning the effects on your mind, comes from a burial site high in the Pamir Mountains of western China. The site is called Zhangzhou Cemetery. Archaeologists led by Yimin Yang and Ren Meng of the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing excavated 10 wooden bowls called braziers from 8 tombs. Inside the bowls were stones that had been superheated, and on those stones were the chemical traces of cannabis, specifically cannabis containing an unusually high concentration of tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the compound that produces the drug's psychoactive effect. This was deliberate. This was not an accident. Someone had chosen high-potency plants, placed them on heated stones inside a vessel, and breathed the smoke during burial rituals. The date was approximately 2,500 years ago, but that is nowhere near the beginning of the story. The earliest confirmed evidence of tobacco use comes from a site called Wishbone in northwestern Utah. In 2015, archaeologist Darren Duke of the Far Western Anthropological Research Group was conducting a survey of the Great Salt Lake Desert when his team found a small smudge on the open mud flats, a black patch, a few bird bones sticking out. It was an ancient hearth, one of the oldest open-air hearths ever found in North America's desert west. When they processed the sediment back in the lab using a technique called manual flotation, in which sediment is submerged in water to separate organic material from inorganic material, Duke's botanist spotted something extraordinary. Tiny seeds, burned, belonging to Nicotiana attenuata, known as coyote tobacco, a wild desert tobacco plant, whose closest habitat was 8 miles from the fire site. No duck carried those seeds there, no wind. A human being brought them. Radiocarbon dating of 3 separate carbon samples from the hearth placed the fire at approximately 12,300 years ago. That is 9,000 years older than the previous oldest known evidence of tobacco use. And it places this moment not in a settled village, not in an agricultural civilization, but around a campfire during the Ice Age when mammoths were still alive and the Great Salt Lake Desert was a wetland. Duke's team published their findings in the journal Nature Human Behavior in October 2021. His conclusion was direct. Humans learned about tobacco's intoxicating properties very shortly after first arriving in the Americas, which researchers estimate occurred between 13,000 and 16,000 years ago. They found the plant, noticed what it did, and kept coming back to it. So tobacco was not discovered by Europeans in the 15th century. It was not an invention of the New World's settled farming cultures. It was already 12,000 years old by the time any of that happened. But here is the counterintuitive part. The Wishbone fire is not evidence of smoking the way you think of smoking. It is not a pipe or a rolled leaf or anything manufactured. It is seeds near a hearth, which means the earliest documented use of tobacco may have been much simpler and in some ways stranger. Duke and his colleagues suggest several possibilities. The seeds may have been chewed and spat into the fire. They may have been scattered over the embers to release their smoke into the air above the hearth. They may have been held directly in the mouth. None of these requires a pipe. None of them requires fire at all, in fact. What they all require is intention. Someone knew what these seeds did. Someone went 8 miles out of their way to get them. And someone brought them back to the fire. That knowledge was not written anywhere. It lived in people. It passed from one generation to the next through demonstration and memory and practice across hundreds of generations before anyone on Earth had conceived of agriculture cities, writing, or civilization of any kind. Now step back even further, because Wishbone only captures the moment that practice entered the Americas. The human story before that was playing out on other continents, in other ecosystems, around other fires, with other plants. The Amazon basin is home to hundreds of psychoactive plant species. The African savanna, where your ancestors evolved, contains dozens of plants with strong mood-altering properties. Southeast Asia, where fire use was also ancient, is one of the richest pharmacological environments on Earth. The likelihood that smoke inhalation of mind-altering plants was happening across these regions long before the invention of ceramics or settled life, is considered very high by researchers studying the deep history of human intoxicant use. The evidence just does not survive that long. Seeds decay. Smoke leaves no prints in stone. The older the site, the thinner the record becomes. What archaeology can confirm is the broad picture. By 2,500 years ago at Dzierżankal Cemetery, the burning of psychoactive plants was formalized, ritualized, and deliberate enough to be included in burial ceremonies. By 12,300 years ago at the Wishbone site, tobacco was being carried deliberately across landscapes by Ice Age hunter-gatherers. And by 1 million years ago at Wonderwork Cave, your ancestors were sitting inside smoke-filled rock chambers and breathing whatever was burning. The line from Wonderwork to the first deliberate tobacco use is not a straight line. It is a long, slow accumulation of curiosity, experimentation, and inherited knowledge. One group notices that a specific plant smells different when it burns. Another group notices that their healer always throws the same leaves on the fire before a ceremony. Another group begins carrying those leaves on purpose. Over tens of thousands of years, what began as an accident became a tradition. Anthropologist Andrew Sherratt, in his influential work on the role of psychoactive substances in prehistoric cultures, argued that the deliberate use of mind-altering plants was not a fringe behavior in ancient societies, but a central one. Rituals that created altered states were social events. They bound groups together. They marked transitions, births, deaths, seasons. The plants were not recreational distractions. They were technology. They were one of the tools your ancestors used to hold the group together. That reframe matters. Your ancestors were not weak or careless when they reached for psychoactive plants. They were socially sophisticated enough to recognize that shared experiences of altered consciousness created trust memory and meaning inside a group. The fire, the smoke, the plant, the shared altered state. That was a technology of belonging. Today you might sit with friends and feel that same pull. A shared drink, a shared cigarette, a shared moment that changes the texture of time together. The product has changed beyond recognition. The chemistry has been isolated, concentrated, weaponized by industry. But the impulse it hijacks is at least 12,000 years old, probably much older. You wake up craving nicotine. Your brain treats the craving as urgent biological necessary. And in a sense, it is following a pathway that was carved by millions of years of human curiosity, experimentation, and fire. You have been doing this for a very long time.